Yes. My name is Eun Lee. I'm the executive director of the Dream Unfinished. And on today's conversation, I'm joined by Sarah Overton, who is the production manager for the Dream Unfinished, a fabulous cellist, and also the producer of the Missing Year project, which is another project that you should be checking out. And then also Melanie Zeck, who is an esteemed musicologist. She was based at the Center for Black Music Research for 15 years, and she is the co-author of this book, which you should check out if you don't already have, The Transformation of Black Music. So before we dive in, I did just want to introduce three musical terms, because I'm not sure if there are folks in the audience that are sort of classical music aficionados or nerds or people that are newer to the art form. So the three terms are, number one, musicology. And Melanie, maybe you could even jump in here a little bit too. The differentiation between musicology, which, people, if they're thinking of their suffixes and prefixes, it's the study of music. But musicology differing from ethnomusicology in the sense that musicology generally falls on music that's in what we would call the classical art form. Would you say that's about right, Melanie?
Sure. Both fields have really been expanding over the last few years, but from a historical perspective, and we are talking about a lot of history today, that's a pretty fair assessment.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to just frame the fact that musicology is study of classical music. Ethnomusicology then is study of what has traditionally been called or sort of categorized as world music, which I think already in that sort of bifurcation and that framing points to, that classical music is music and then the rest of the world is ethnomusic. And that, obviously there's a lot of discourse around how those lines are blurring and how that framing at the outset is something that could be worth considering or reconsidering. So that's musicology. We're going to use that word a lot. String quartet. Sarah, as the cellist with your handy instrument behind you, do you want to explain not only string quartet, the genre, but then also string quartet, the ensemble?
Yeah, so string quartets are a part of a genre of chamber music, which means unconducted music, so music led without a conductor. And a string quartet itself is usually composed, and I say usually because there are some, that differ as we go farther and farther along in music, but traditionally they're composed of two violinists, first violin, second violin, a violist, and a cellist, so 4 musicians in total.
Perfect. And then the last term, so we have musicology, we have string quartet, and then we have pastoral. And pastoral is a genre of music that's often, somewhat bucolic in nature or actually inspired and sort of sounding like the sounds of nature. And I invite you both to just elaborate a little bit more on how you would define that term.
I'll let Sarah go first.
Yeah, I think, pastoral music, and like you said, is traditionally reflective of landscape and kind of a calming sort of scenic environment. So we see pastorals coming from Beethoven and his Sixth Symphony, so a lot of just really serene environment is what I have traditionally defined myself as thinking of a pastoral. So Melanie, do you have anything to add to that?
Oh, I was thinking of Berlioz's Overture to Rob Roy, or maybe Symphonie Fantastique. There's the oboe and the English horn going back and forth, and it evokes like a shepherd. Am I thinking of the right thing? And it's just, I agree with what Sarah and Un said. It's outdoors, serene, meadows, lots of thoughts of green.
Yeah, I think we're all sort of hungry for the outdoors and green, especially right now. So, but now that we've gotten the terminology out of the way, so I just wanted to give a quick overview of what to expect in today's conversation. So we're going to begin with this story that I think has perhaps piqued a lot of folks' curiosity, interest, as far as how really the events of Dr. King's assassination directly led into quite an important impact on the field of Black musicology, specifically through the trajectory of musicologist Dominique Rene De Lerma, as well as the compositional output of David Baker, and how this event from the 1960s has implications for classical music practitioners today. And then to actually spend a good amount of time on the composer David Baker and his work Pastoral, and how that was really the sort of catalyst for a lot of the musicology that was able to come forward from it since. And so, just as an aside, I did want to actually kind of frame this. I've been doing a little bit of my own homework around Dr. David Baker, and there was a quote that he shared around Dr. King. So David Baker says that Dr. King said, facts in and of themselves have no meaning. Facts are only meaningful when they're connected to other facts. So I hope that in our conversation, we'll be connecting some of these facts so that people can see how this trajectory has really had a very long arc from that pivotal event to where we find ourselves today. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Sarah. She's actually going to be reading from this book by Dominique Rene De Lerma, Reflections on Afro-American Music, where he is sharing from his own words his experience of this catalytic event. So Sarah, please take it away.
So Dr. De Lerma writes, "It was about 8:30 on the morning of April 5th, 1968, that I received a telephone call from our dean, Wilfred C. Bain of the Indiana University School of Music. The president of the university had announced a memorial service to be held on campus at noon to commemorate the death of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., and Dean Bain had offered the resident Berkshire String Quartet to provide music for the ceremonies. As music librarian, I was charged with the provision of an elegiac work for string quartet written by a Black composer, which the ensemble could rehearse and perform within 3 hours. I paused for a moment. Dean sensed my quandary. Who were the Black composers? Long alert to the essence of Black culture, he had continued the evolution of the jazz program at North Texas State University while he served as dean. It was already developing in 1938 and became a curricular activity under Dean Walter H. Hodgson in 1947 when Dean Bain moved to Indiana. It was Dean Bain who hired Richard Johnson in 1949, Indiana University's first Black professor, and it was he who immediately mentioned the names of several Black composers for my catalog check: Edmund Dede, Clarence Cameron White, William Grant Still, Ulysses Kay, Harry Burleigh, Howard Swanson, and others. Even though some of these names were known to me, and even though I had thought of a few others within the next hour, I had no concept of what the music of those figures was like, excepting a few works of Still, Kay, and Swanson. I promised him I would do my best and ran off to the card catalog of the nation's 5th largest music library to see what was the state of our holdings in this area. The concept of integration, which existed up to Dr. King's death in many communities, centered around the willingness to ignore color and, with it, culture. It was fashionable to regard all men as brothers and as equals. Such a noble philosophy carried with it the quote-unquote liberal implication that Anglo-American society could accept those of other heritages as long as the behavior would be white. This is why Black composers were generally identified as Black only by photograph, reputation, or citation in some of the basic research which had been conducted by scholars such as John Duncan, W.C. Handy, James Trotter, or Maud Cuny Hare. Despite the Moorish blood in my purple veins, despite the pride I had in my own cultural Black background, despite my residence for a decade virtually next door to a sanctified church and the extraordinary fragrance of Saturday night's barbecue in my neighbor's yard, despite my own experiences in public school with racism, despite my close association with numerous Afro-American musicians, I had a long way to go before I could understand how my own education had directed my every thought to the exclusive support of European quote-unquote masterworks. There were some exceptions in my education, however. Just now, it seems that the strongest of these came from the late Paul Nettle, who had been chairman of my graduate committee during my doctoral musicology days at Indiana University. Dr. Nettle was a Czech Jew who escaped from the Nazis at the last moment. Possibly, that experience played a major role in his own development, but he told his students that he did not teach micrology, that he was interested in music as an end in itself, but also in the extent to which it related to society. His lectures and tests always guided us gently to think of music in these terms, but I am now only beginning to understand the extent to which his teaching opened philosophical doors that might have remained shut had I not had the experience of his guidance. And those doors lead out of the ivory tower to the people. This is the path his own son has taken, Bruno Nettel, one of the most distinguished ethnomusicologists of our time. I had not assimilated all of this when, in 1968, I began my search for a string quartet. It came as a shock to my acquisitional self-righteousness, however, when I discovered how very few works by Black composers we had in our library. There was not one composition which would have been suitable. Only then did it dawn on us that, in David Baker, we had a Black composer on our own faculty. How could we have overlooked Dave? Simply because society had encouraged us not to notice the color of one's skin, plus the fact that one not often expects to find a solution so close at hand. The university auditorium was filled at noon. Probably every Black student and professor on the campus attended service, and white representation was not minimal. It was a decade of murders. The assassination of John Kennedy was still fresh in our minds. We did not anticipate the events of Jackson State nor of Kent State. Dr. King had begun to make popular many of the ideas of W.E.B. Du Bois, particularly as they applied to the Vietnamese War. He had led us gently to a moral consciousness which truly subversive elements had hidden and euphemized. He had survived attacks from his own people and from white bigoted nationalists, but he became only more devoted to humanity and more resolved to implement his dream. The power of his eloquent lyricism had just ended hours before, and he became the patron saint of the garbage collectors. From the trash cans to the halls of one of the nation's most distinguished universities is a long distance, but this is the fault of the academic institutions. The gap was partially bridged that day, and Blacks and whites shared a profound grief, but only the Blacks really know why the caged bird sings. A series of brief talks by the most articulate Black students and faculty of the campus summarized and extended Dr. King's ideas, and only one speaker militantly laid out plans for the future. The quartet played David Baker's Pastoral, but already in Dave's mind were plans for that evening's initial work of what became a masterwork, Black America. I felt the time had come for me to restructure the hostilities of my own minority memberships in a creative manner, to leave the ivory halls if necessary. I did not fully understand just then that my part could be played using my professional skills if I accepted the implicit challenges coming from Dr. King, Dean Bain, Dave Baker, Paul Nettel, T.J. Anderson, and the prejudices of former classmates.
Sarah, thank you so much for reading. Yeah, so I think, Melanie, can you distill a little bit what we just listened to?
It's really a transformative moment in this man's life. You've got what became the most prolific writer of small writings on Black music research for the rest of the 20th century, and certainly in the pantheon of Black music research specialists for the end of this century. And you have him talking about this day, this moment at 8:30 in the morning. He remembers it so specifically. And I'm also a librarian, so I know what it's like to be sitting at a reference desk to get a phone call and suddenly you're it. And of course, this is long before the internet. So he walks you through very systematically what he's being told, how he's being told it, the urgency with which this is supposed to take place, and the fact that he has no idea what he's doing. But here's the catch. If you go back to what he says, he remembers a few of the names. He also, Dean Bain also remembers a few of the names, but he says, even though some of these names were known to me, and even though I had thought of a few others within the next hour, I had no concept of what the music of these figures were like. That's incredible. You have on the one hand, this man who's operating the reference desk, arguably the informational center of the School of Music. It's the 5th largest music library in 1968 in the entire United States. He doesn't even know what to do. So he also goes and mentions, and Sarah, he mentions some resources, some scholars who had actually gone through and chronicled a lot of the work by Black composers. And I wanted to call attention to their names. James Monroe Trotter was the very first Black music historian. He was writing in 1878. And his book is just a phenomenal chronicling of the kinds of music making, music consumption activities that took place among African Americans and practitioners in the African diaspora way back in the 19th century. Again, that's James Monroe Trotter, 1878. The title of his book is Music and Some Highly Musical People. And that's available online for free. You can read the whole thing. What I think you'll find very interesting about the relationship between De Lerma and Trotter is Trotter had a fantastic command of the literature of all the European music making practices and mainstream, quote unquote, American practices going on in the first 4 chapters of his book really talk about the power of music, just as what Sarah was saying, echoing Dave Baker, echoing Dr. King, that there are facts, but you have to be able to connect them. Music has the power to do good things. And so, of course, that's why we're here today. The second book that he mentioned was by Maud Cuny Hare. And that was published in 1936. That was a huge gap between 1878 and 1936. Then he mentions 2 more. One is by W.C. Handy, and one is by John Duncan. John Duncan's book focused only on opera, and W.C. Handy's book, of course, talked about some composers, but really talked about people of the African diaspora doing more popular musical cultures. So that means between 1878 in 1968, De Lerma is in this massive trove of information. He's thinking of 2 resources in the last 90 years that he might be able to use. He has no idea what to do. What's really interesting, Un and Sarah, is by the end of his life, he had written over 1,000 documents about Black musicology, Black music research, which is what a lot of us call that particular field of study. And he took it from such a wide perspective, but this day was critical to him because he realized, remember that phrase, his acquisitional self-righteousness? He was really concerned that the library was not able to offer this kind of information, not just to him as a music librarian, but his musicological colleagues, and more importantly, the students the institution served. So he would not let this rest. It is my understanding that very soon after April the 5th, he went back to Dean Bain and he said, we have to do something about this. So Dean Bain manages to pull a committee of people together. It's 4 people: Dean Bain, David Baker, Dominique Rene De Lerma, and Austin Caswell, who at the time, and would go on to be, a very renowned musicologist in the traditional sense. The 4 of these men realized they had to deal with a number of issues simultaneously. Information. They had to find it, they had to compile it, and they had to disseminate it. But the facts, those are just facts. There's people behind the facts. And not only that, these facts and these people are all making music. So what they decided to do, Dean Bain was able to give them a little bit of money, and they started a Black Music Committee. Black Music Committee put together a series of seminars bringing like-minded practitioners from all over the United States to Indiana University, and they held seminars. And the books that Un showed you are the result of these seminars. And believe it or not, Un and Sarah, I still refer to these books today because they address the exact same issues we have in our teaching, I have in my librarianship and my work in musicology. And quite frankly, they contextualize what we now have our contemporary calls for action, these desires, these impetuses to change the way we're learning about music in mainstream institutions. De Lerma and his colleagues were able to articulate precisely why the music hadn't been included in mainstream discourse. But on the flip side, if you go to these books, you will find appendix after research document, after lists of recordings available. These books in and of themselves were then integrated into the library as resources to propel the next generation of students. So over time, they had the Black Music Committee. They then started the Black Music Center, which was designed to be the nexus for all musicians, music lovers, anybody who wanted to learn more. This is where you could get your information. Now, De Lerma actually left Indiana University in 1973, but he went on to work at several institutions throughout the United States. He was also director of the Center for Black Music Research in Chicago in the 1990s. And over the course of his life, he continued to chronicle people's lives, chronicle their music making throughout the African diaspora, but also connect the dots. We're heavily indebted to the work that he did and to the work of his colleagues, such as Eileen Southern, Josephine Wright, Robert Stevenson, Samuel A. Floyd. And those are just the first four that I can think of off the top of my head. But when you think about these calls for action today, it's interesting to see how they are contextualized historically. And to go from a moment where you're in this large institution, library, you think you'll be able to find this information. Today, all we have to do is pop onto the internet and log on. But there's more. We have to go back to what De Lerma is saying. We have to go back to what Dave Baker is saying. We have to go back to what Dr. King is saying. The facts are the facts, but they're only facts until they're linked to other facts. The body of works that we now have available to us is what I consider to be just an explosion of research. It would be impossible to read through all of the resources that have come out of this major event. But that's a good thing, because that also gives us the opportunity to have conversations with each other about some of the ideas that we're thinking about and infuse each other's knowledge with something that we know from our own reading. And I think maybe Sarah and Un could take it from there, but I feel like when you think about bringing your own energy and your own work, remember that there are librarians, musicologists, programmers, and all sorts of people who are interested in advancing the knowledge and the chronicling and the connection of the facts of this particular vein of music history, not just within the United States, but within the African diaspora as a whole.
Yeah, Melanie, I mean, it's really so fascinating how much came out of this, just one person's dedication to this research and the collaborations that he built. And I know he goes on a little bit later within this preface to talk about the Black Music Center and, building something for future researchers to come in or composers to come in and think through Black music and make some recordings and things like that. So it's really amazing. But I want to ask this question, because it is Black History Month and we're talking a lot about Black composers and Black compositions. And Dominique Rene De Lerma was a white musicologist. So I'm curious just in the context of shaping this program, why feature a white musicologist within this talk that we're having?
Yeah, Sarah, thank you for that. And I mean, I will profess that there was a little bit of hand-wringing, honestly, in terms of particularly in the climate that we're in. But I think Melanie did a really wonderful job as far as explaining the legacy that and the just sheer output and the volume of output that De Lerma left with us. So I think, when you and I were talking about this earlier, Sarah, at one point you had said his name's probably going to come up again in our show. So people should know to whom it is that we're referring. But I think another really interesting juxtaposition is, De Lerma had this singular pivotal event that he can point to that really changed his entire professional trajectory. I mean, Melanie, if I'm getting this right, he was like a Stravinsky expert and very much, in the Western canon as we know it. And then really it was because of this one day in April in 1968 that his entire life path and the second half of his professional and personal life largely completely went into a different direction.
Yes, yeah. And I noticed that Sarah mentioned T.J. Anderson. Now, T.J. Anderson and De Lerma were almost complete contemporaries. I think they were both born in 1928. They had been friends all the way since the 1950s. And T.J. Anderson is still living. He's a composer in Atlanta. He's in his 90s. And he really helped De Lerma to transition from this Stravinsky, this kind of Ives musicology, and take that energy, harness it, and again, use the professional skills of a librarian and musicologist to do what he did best on a set of musics that, as De Lerma indicated, between 1878 and the current day, had not yet been fully mined, M-I-N-E-D, for the kind of information we need to make the artistic and aesthetic choices as professionals today.
Well, and then speaking of today, I mean, obviously there is much more interest now in music by underrepresented composers, particularly following the events of 2020. But so not only is there that part of the today, but I think the other important framing is really De Lerma is almost an archetype for a project like The Dream Unfinished. I mean, he had this pivotal date of April 1968, and we can point to a similar, specific point in time where really, for those who are not familiar, The Dream Unfinished was founded in response to the Black Lives Matter movement, and particularly with the passing of Eric Garner in New York. So it was really a group of classical musicians based in New York at that time that just kind of wondered out loud, like, is there anything that we uniquely can do as classical musicians? Like, can we in the first place? And that was what spurred on our first concert, which was really conceived as a one-off event that has since just very organically and surprisingly grown into what we do now, which is this this nonprofit organization of volunteers that's really dedicated towards programming music and highlighting these kinds of issues. So I would say that very much like De Lerma, we kind of accidentally ended up on this now dedicated path towards really doing our best to be this this very wide-ranging group that not only include practitioners of color, but also allies or people who see themselves as allies, which I think, De Lerma very much cast himself in that role.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Anne, and thanks, Melanie. Melanie, we're actually getting a quick question in the live chat. If you can add or just say again the two titles of the books that you're referencing.
Oh, of course. The one from 1970 is Black Music in Our Culture. And the one from 1973 is Reflections on Afro-American Music. For those of you who have teachers who have access to various academic library databases, or for those of you who are already studying at an institution that has access to library databases, don't be surprised when you get onto these databases and you find lots and lots of smaller articles by De Lerma in journals such as the Music Educators Journal. Un was a longtime member of the National Association for Music Education, which has been historically the sponsor of Music Educators Journal. And indeed, De Lerma published there to try to widen the base of interested people and provide people with these resources. But again, I think you'll find these two books to be extremely insightful and also informative even for today.
Awesome. Thank you, Melanie. And yeah, again, we'll drop those book names in the chat, and anything else from this discussion today, we'll be sure to have some links available to you afterwards. So thank you all so much for tuning in. I mean, this was just a joy to be here and be among, the music nerds and really just kind of get into it about Black classical music, especially at this important time in our history. And, I know that this is something that we're going to be able to carry with us every day. So, I'm just grateful to be here for this conversation. And if you like conversations like these, please go ahead and click our like button. Please subscribe. We're going to have more in this YouTube series that The Dream Unfinished is putting together. It's going to be a rich and wonderful conversation, just as it has been today. So thank you, everyone, again, and we will hope to see you next time.